I stood at the edge of what everyone in Hardin County called the dead quarter, 160 acres that hadn't grown a decent crop since before the crash. It was a Tuesday morning, April 14th, 1936, and the wind was pulling dust off the ridges in long gray ribbons. The bank had tried to sell it 3 times. No takers. The soil was exhausted, they said. Poisoned by bad rotation and worse luck. The previous owner, a man named Virgil Kemp, had walked away in 32, owing more than the land would ever be worth. I was 63 years old that spring. My father had been dead 11 years. My wife, Clara, 6 months. The farm I'd worked since I was a boy, 80 acres of good bottomland along Honey Creek, was paid off, but it was small, and my sons had gone to Chicago and Detroit for factory work. I didn't blame them. There wasn't enough land to split 3 ways, and the Depression had taught every young man in Iowa that a paycheck beats a prayer. But I couldn't sit still. Clara used to say I had the same problem my father had. I needed ground under my boots and work that didn't end at 5 o'clock. So when the county assessor, a man named Floyd Hutchins, mentioned over coffee at Mabel's Diner that the dead quarter was going up for auction one last time, I asked what they wanted for it. He looked at me like I'd asked to buy the moon. "Tom," he said, "that ground's been rode hard and put up wet for 20 years. You be throwing money into a hole." "How much?" He stirred his coffee. "Reserve's $10. Nobody's bid on it yet. $10. Less than a good plow horse. Less than a week's wages at the deer plant in Waterloo." I went out there that afternoon. Drove my 1929 Ford pickup down County Road 18. Turned onto the old Kemp access road. 2 ruts through thistle and brome grass as high as the running boards. The fence posts were rotted off at the ground. The windmill by the stock tank had lost 3 blades and stood there like a broken skeleton. I walked a quarter mile into the section, pulled up a handful of dirt, and rubbed it between my fingers. It was pale. Loose. It didn't hold together the way soil should. But it wasn't clay, and it wasn't pure sand. It was tired, not dead. I'd seen tired before. I thought about my father, about a notebook he'd kept, written in pencil on lined paper, with the header Soil Notes, H.W. Bridger, 1911 to 1928. I still had it in a wooden box under my bed. I went back to the truck and sat there with the door open, looking out over what everyone else had written off. The wind moved through the weeds in long waves. A red-tailed hawk circled over the far tree line. I could hear the creak of that broken windmill turning slow on its rusted bearing. I drove into town and found Earl Hutchins at the bank. He was behind his desk, sleeves rolled up, adding columns in a ledger. I told him I wanted to buy the Kemp place. He looked at me like I'd asked to buy the moon. "Hope," he said, "that land hasn't grown a decent crop in 15 years, maybe longer." Kemp tried. His brother tried before him. The extension man from Ames came out in 31 and said it was blown out and leached past saving. You'd be throwing money into a hole. I told him I had $40. He laughed, not mean, just tired. "The county's asking 10 for the back taxes. If you want to waste $10, I'll draw up the deed." I put a $10 bill on his desk. He stared at it for a long moment, then pulled out a form and started writing. Tuesday, November the 17th, 1936. I signed my name at the bottom, Elias Hope Bridger. Earl signed as witness. He slid the deed across the desk and said, "Good luck, Hope. You're gonna need it." I drove home with that deed folded in my shirt pocket. My wife, Margaret, was at the stove when I came in. I told her what I'd done. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she turned and looked at me with those steady gray eyes and said, "Your father would have done the same thing." That was all, but it was enough. That night I pulled the wooden box out from under the bed and opened it. Inside was my father's notebook, a tin of old seed packets, a surveyor's tape, and a small cloth bag of something I didn't recognize as a boy, but understood now. Inoculant powder for legumes, sealed in 1927. I sat at the kitchen table under the oil lamp and opened the notebook. The first page read, "Soil is a living thing. It can be killed, but it can also be brought back. Patience and rotation. No shortcuts." I read until past midnight. Every page was a record. My father had divided the land into zones, not by what grew there now, but by what the soil had been before it was ruined. Zone A, bottomland, clay-heavy, prone to standing water. Zone B, the eastern slope, sandy loam, fast-draining. Zone C, the ridge, thin topsoil over limestone. Zone D, the old pasture, compacted from decades of cattle. Each zone had its own prescription. For Zone A, he'd written, tile drainage first, then winter rye to break up clay, spring oats the second year, red clover the third. Do not plant corn until year 4. For Zone B, cowpeas in summer heat, turn under in August, follow with winter wheat, rotate with soybeans. The notebook went on for 60 pages. Crop rotations, planting dates, moon phases, rainfall records going back to 1911. There were sketches of drainage patterns, notes on which seeds came from which neighbor, warnings about frost pockets in the low corner near the creek. I didn't sleep much that spring. Every morning before dawn, I was out there with a shovel and a wheelbarrow, clearing rocks, pulling stumps, burning brush piles that had been there so long they'd started to rot into the ground. The land was worse than I thought. Thistle everywhere, bindweed choking what was left of the fence rows. In some places, the soil was so hard, I couldn't get a spade in more than 2 inches. I borrowed a moldboard plow from Earl Hutchins, the only man in the county who didn't laugh when I told him what I was doing. He was 76 then, still farming 80 acres with a 1938 Farmall H. He brought the plow over on a Thursday in late March and helped me hitch it to my father's old Alice Chalmers WD. Your daddy knew what he was about, Earl said, running his hand along the plow's curved blade. This land'll come back if you give it time. But it won't be this year. Maybe not next year either. I started with Zone D, the old pasture, plowed it shallow, just enough to break the crust. Then I broadcast 20 pounds of hairy vetch per acre, mixed with winter rye. By May, the field was green for the first time in 15 years. People driving past on County Road 18 slowed down to look. Some of them stopped. A few asked questions. Most just shook their heads and kept going. I didn't care. I was following the notebook. By June, I had Zone D turned under and planted with soybeans, not for harvest, for nitrogen. The notebook said soybeans would pull what the vetch started, fix it deeper, leave the soil ready for corn the following spring. I bought the seed from Hendrick's Feed and Grain in Ottawa for $18 a bushel, planted it with a hand-cranked seeder my grandfather had used in 1929. It took me 4 days to cover those 12 acres. My back went out on day 3. I slept on the porch that night with a hot water bottle and a fifth of whiskey Earl brought over without my asking. Zone C was harder. That was the old cornfield, the one Harlan had beaten to death with anhydrous ammonia and continuous corn for 9 straight years. The soil was gray, compacted, lifeless. I plowed it twice, once in July, shallow, just to crack it open. Then I let it sit through August while I bush-hogged Zone B, the timber lot along the creek. I didn't cut the trees. I cleared the understory, the wild grape and poison ivy, opened it up so air could move. There were black walnuts in there, 12 of them, probably 60 years old. I marked each one with orange paint so I'd remember where they stood. In September, I plowed Zone C again, deeper this time, 8 inches, and I could see the difference. The soil turned darker as it came up. There was structure starting to come back. I broadcast clover and let it go into fall. By October, it was ankle high and still green when the first frost came. That winter, I didn't do much. I patched the barn roof, rebuilt the hog shed foundation, and read the notebook cover to cover 3 more times. There were pages in the back I hadn't noticed before. Notes about crop rotation, about rest years, about how my grandfather had let a field go fallow every 7th season no matter what the bank said. He called it tithing the land. I decided Zone A, the front 40 along the road, would sit out 1934 entirely. Just native grasses. No plow, no seed, nothing. People thought I'd lost my mind. Spring of '34 came early. By mid-March, I had Zone B ready, the middle section, 28 acres that had shown the most promise the year before. I planted oats mixed with field peas, something my grandfather had noted as insurance crop. Feeds the soil or feeds the hogs. Either way, you win. The oats came up strong. By May, they were waist-high, and the peas were climbing through them like they'd been doing it together for 100 years. Zone C got corn again, but this time I side-dressed it with composted manure from the Henderson's dairy operation. They let me haul it away for free just to clear their lot. Cost me nothing but diesel and a day's labor. Zone A, the front 40, sat there like a church lawn. Tall fescue, little blue stem, some volunteer clover creeping in from the year before. Neighbors slowed down when they drove past. A few honked. One morning in June, Carl Pritchard stopped his truck in the road, leaned out the window, and shouted, "You growing grass now, Hope? That the new cash crop?" I waved. Didn't say a word. Let him think what he wanted. By July, the oats in Zone B were ready. I cut them with the binder, shocked them in the field, and let them cure for 10 days. Threshed them the first week of August, got 41 bushels to the acre. Not record-breaking, but triple what that ground had given anyone in a decade. I sold half and kept half for seed. The peas I plowed under green. Nitrogen straight into the soil. The corn in Zone C came in better than the year before. Stalks were thicker. Ears were longer, and the kernels filled all the way to the tip. I pulled a few ears in late August and shucked them right there in the row. The cobs were tight even. No gaps. I stood there turning one over in my hands, and I thought about my grandfather standing in this same field 60 years earlier, holding an ear just like it. Same dirt, same sky, same patience. By October, I had 73 acres under some kind of cover. Oats stubble with clover coming back, corn stalks I'd chopped and spread, and that front 40 still resting, thicker and greener than it had any right to be. The land was starting to remember what it used to be. That winter, I didn't touch it. Let the frost work. Let the snow melt slow and soak in. I spent January and February in the barn, going through my grandfather's notebooks again, this time looking at what he'd planted where and when. He'd kept a rotation, corn, oats, clover, back to corn, but he'd also marked certain strips as fallow second year, or peas then rest. There was a logic to it I hadn't seen the first time through. He wasn't just rotating crops. He was rotating effort, giving each section a chance to breathe. In March of 1937, I walked the whole property again with a notebook of my own. I drew it out in squares, labeled each one, wrote down what I'd done and what I planned next. Zone A, the front 40, would stay in clover one more year. Zone B, I'd plant oats again, then turn it under. Zone C would go back to corn, but I'd leave the edges in grass to hold the wind. Zone D, the back 20 that was still mostly thistle and brome, I'd start working that spring, slow, 5 acres at a time. April came in wet. I couldn't get on the field until the third week. When I did, I took the farm all back to Zone D with the plow set shallow and turned just the top 4 inches. The thistle roots went everywhere, thick as my wrist in places. But I didn't try to pull them all at once. I turned them, let them dry, came back 2 weeks later and disked them under. Then I planted oats heavy, 100 pounds to the acre, and let them choke out what was left. By June, the whole place looked like a patchwork quilt. Clover in front, oats coming up thick in the middle, corn rows in Zone C standing knee-high and dark green, and that back section starting to show something other than weeds. People driving past on the county road slowed down. A few stopped. One man, I didn't know his name, leaned out his truck window and asked if I was the one who'd bought the Hutchins place. I said I was. He looked out over the rows, then back at me. "Well," he said, "I'll be damned." Then he drove off. I stood there in the driveway, dirt on my boots, sun on my back, and I thought, we're not done yet. Not even close. By August, I had my first real test. The corn in Zone C, the section I'd planted earliest, the one I'd worked the hardest, started to tassel. I walked those rows every morning before the sun got high, checking the silk, watching for borers, running my hand along the stalks. They were thick, solid, the kind of corn you could lean your weight against, and it wouldn't give. My father used to say you could tell a good stand by the sound it made in the wind, not a rattle, but a low hum, like the whole field was breathing together. That's what I heard. On August 14th, a Thursday, I pulled an ear from the middle of the row, peeled back the husk and pressed my thumbnail into a kernel. Milk came out clean and white. I stood there holding that ear, dirt under my nails, sweat running down my neck, and I knew we'd done it. The land had come back. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to prove it could be done. Word got around fast in a county that size. By the end of the month, I had 3 men show up unannounced, wanting to see the place. One was from the extension office. One was a neighbor I'd never met who farmed 2 sections north of me. The third was a banker from Ottawa. They walked the rows, bent down to check the root structure, pulled ears and weighed them in their hands. Nobody said much. The extension man took notes in a little spiral pad. The neighbor asked what I'd used for seed. I told him, Pioneer 307, same as anybody. He shook his head. Same seed, he said. Different result. The banker didn't ask questions. He just looked out over the field and then looked at me and said, "If you need operating capital for next year, come see me." I thanked him. I didn't tell him I still had $127 left from what I'd started with. I figured I'd let the land do the talking. By October, I brought in 42 bushels to the acre off Zone C. That doesn't sound like much now, but in 1931, on land everyone said was finished, it was enough to turn heads. I sold it all to the co-op in Fairfield for 68 cents a bushel, paid off what I owed at the hardware store, bought seed for the next spring and put the rest in a coffee can under the kitchen floorboard. That winter, I didn't rest. I spent January and February walking every acre I hadn't touched yet, zones D, E, and F, mapping drainage, marking where the old fence lines used to run, digging test holes every 100 feet to see what the soil was doing 6 inches down. On February 14th, 1932, I found something in Zone E that changed everything. There was a low spot, maybe 3 acres, where water pooled every spring. Everyone who'd farmed this land before had just plowed around it, left it to the cattails and the red-winged blackbirds. But when I dug down, I hit clay at 18 inches. Good, tight clay. The kind that holds water like a jug. And just upslope from it, maybe 40 yards west, there was a seep coming out of the hillside, clear and cold even in February. I stood there in the mud, breath smoking, and I thought, this isn't a problem. This is a gift. I spent the next 6 weeks with a shovel and a wheelbarrow, cutting a shallow ditch from the seep down into the low spot, widening the basin, piling the dirt into a low berm on the downhill side. By the end of March, I had a pond. Not big, maybe half an acre of open water, but deep enough that it didn't freeze solid and fed year-round by that seep. I stocked it with bluegill fingerlings I bought from a man in Ottumwa for $2. By summer, the cattle from the Hensley place next door were coming through the fence to drink from it. I didn't mind. I just fixed the fence and left the gate open on my side. Hensley came by in July, saw what I'd done, and said, "You know that's the first standing water in this section that doesn't go dry by August." I nodded. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "You need help with harvest, you let me know." I thanked him. That was the first time anyone in the county offered me something without me asking. The pond did more than water livestock. It changed the air. The mornings were cooler near it. The birds came back that fall. I hadn't realized they'd been gone until I heard them again. Red-winged blackbirds in the cattails that had seated themselves along the pond edge. Killdeer running the mudflats when the water pulled back in dry weeks. And in the evenings, herons, great blue herons, standing in the shallows like they'd been waiting for me to finish what I'd started. I'd seen herons as a boy, before the drainage projects, before every wetland in the county got tiled and turned. But I hadn't seen one on this land in 40 years. By the spring of 1937, I had 40 acres in alfalfa, 30 in oats, and 20 in pasture that was starting to thicken up with clover and timothy. The rest I left fallow, but I mowed it twice that summer to keep the thistle down and let the soil rest under a low carpet of volunteer grasses. I didn't push it. I knew what happened when you pushed tired ground. The oats came in better than I expected. Not heavy, but clean, with tight heads and no rust. I cut them the second week of July with a binder I'd rebuilt over the winter, and I shocked them in the field the old way. 8 bundles to a shock, caps on top to shed the rain. It took me 4 days. My back reminded me I wasn't 30 anymore, but the work had a rhythm I'd missed. And when I walked the field at dusk and saw those shocks standing in rows, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride exactly, more like rightness. Hensley came by again in August, this time with his son. They helped me thresh. We ran the old case separator I'd bought at auction in Bloomfield, a 1924 model that still had good teeth and a tight drum. We worked from dawn until the light was gone, and when we finished, Hensley's boy looked at the grain in the wagon bed and said, "That's the cleanest oat I've seen this year." Hensley didn't say anything, but he nodded. When they left, he shook my hand, and I knew what that meant. I wasn't the joke anymore. That winter, I sat at the kitchen table with my father's notebook open in front of me and wrote down everything I'd done. Dates, methods, results. Not for anyone else. For me. Because I wanted to remember what worked and I wanted to know why. By 1938, the land was producing more per acre than any farm in Wapello County. The county agent came out in September with a clipboard and a measuring tape, walked the rows, checked the grain bins, and wrote it all down. He didn't say much, but 2 weeks later, the Ottumwa Courier ran a piece about it. Abandoned land becomes model farm, and they printed my name. I didn't ask for that, but I kept the clipping. Other farmers started coming by. Not many, but enough. They'd pull up in their trucks, lean on the fence, and ask questions. What did I plant first? How deep did I plow? What did I do about the thistle? I told them what my father had written, what I'd learned, what had failed. I didn't charge them anything. Knowledge isn't something you hoard. By 1940, I'd paid off the land and bought the adjoining 40 acres from a widow in Eldon who couldn't work it anymore. I gave her a fair price, more than she expected, and she cried when I handed her the cash. That piece had good timber on the north end, and I left it standing. Some things you don't need to clear. The war came, and I stayed. Too old to go, too necessary to leave. I grew soybeans and corn for the government contracts, and I kept the land healthy while I did it. When the boys came home in 45 and 46, some of them came to me looking for work. I hired 3 of them. We built a new barn in 1947, and by 1950, the farm was running 200 acres clean. I'm 81 now. The farm's still here. My son runs it with his boy, and they run it the way I showed them, the way my father showed me. Slow, careful, with respect for what the land can give if you don't take more than it has. People ask me sometimes how I did it, how I turned a $10 joke into something that lasted. I tell them the truth. I didn't do anything special. I just didn't quit. I worked with what I had. I listened to what the old men knew, and I gave the land time to remember what it was. If you've got a piece of ground people say is no good, or a machine they say is too old, or a plan they say won't work, don't listen to them. Listen to the land. Listen to the iron. Listen to the men who came before you. And then get to work. That's all it takes.